I hope it isn't a controversial statement to say we should aim to reduce suffering in the world for both human and non-human animals. But, for the roughly 94% of us globally, myself included, who aren't vegan or vegetarian, we live with the contradiction of eating meat, wearing leather, or using products that have been tested on animals while simultaneously having at least a little bit of guilt and awareness about this. Some, however, see this relaxed acceptance that most of us have as something that demands action, and in some cases, violent action. The United States has long had a strong animal rights movement, perhaps the most famous early figure being Henry Bergh, who founded the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in 1866. The US passed some of the world's first major pieces of animal welfare law, such as the Lacey Act and Migratory Birds Act passed at the start of the 1900s. Much of the modern American animal rights movement, however, can be traced to the era following World War II. The World Wars brought a lull in the animal rights movement, with the atrocities of modern warfare affecting humans taking precedence. Following World War II, however, a couple of important things happened. One, there was a total re-evaluation of morality. The concept of human rights had now been firmly established, but for some, this led to progressing the concept to animals. How could humanity believe in this supposedly great moral system while simultaneously exploiting beings that have their own needs and interests? Secondly, there was a more practical shift in the American relationship to animals. Increasing mechanization of industry after the war resulted in fewer and fewer animals being used for labor and transportation. People didn't work alongside animals anymore. In place of that, new classifications arose. Some animals were meat, some were pets, and many were wildlife. This also resulted in changes to how we talked about animals. Hunting animals was now depicted as more of an evil than a good, with movies like Bambi popularizing this concept. Combine all of this with the other social movements in America at this time, and it's not surprising this era saw some of the greatest progress and activity in the animal rights movement. Tons of new animal welfare organizations sprung up, as well as serious legislation, most notably the Humane Slaughter Act and the Animal Welfare Act. Momentum would only continue to grow into the 1970s, with the most important development being the publication of Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation. Often considered a foundational text in the movement, it took a utilitarian approach, focused on a practical desire to minimize suffering rather than directly appealing to emotion or compassion. It also encouraged vegetarianism and veganism as the most effective measures individuals can take in reducing harm to animals. The ideas put forth didn't go without criticism from the rest of the animal rights movement, however, leading to a split between welfarists and abolitionists. Welfarists advocate for humane treatment of animals, such as improved living conditions and an end to cruel surgical practices, but generally accept human ownership and use of animals. Abolitionists, however, fundamentally disagree with the concept of human-animal ownership, viewing the reduction of sentient beings to property as immoral. They oppose all human use of animals and typically endorse veganism as the only ethical practice. Abolitionists often criticize welfarists, believing that focusing solely on reducing animal suffering misses the core objective of ending all animal exploitation, and that animal welfare regulations only reinforce their position as property. Through the 70s, some abolitionists became frustrated with the slow progress towards their goal, and taking direct action to achieve their aims became increasingly appealing. One of the most popular methods was infiltrating organizations responsible for causing harm to animals to expose these acts. This tactic dates back to at least the 1920s, when activists would embed themselves into hunting and trapping clubs to secretly take photographs of how these groups treated animals. Minor property damage, such as cutting a lock, was often needed for these infiltrators to have full access to the spaces and conditions they wished to document, and property damage would be a popular method of abolitionist activism going forward. One of the first major groups to take violent direct action was the Animal Liberation Front. It was founded in the UK in the early 1970s as an offshoot of the Hunt Saboteurs organization, a group focused on disrupting organized hunting events. The ALF started out by vandalizing research labs that test on animals in Britain, but these activities would soon spread to the United States. The ALF, like a good chunk of the abolitionist animal rights movement, is linked to anarchist politics, and thus lacks centralized leadership, spreads across borders easily, and is hard to attribute specific actions to. The first action in the United States commonly attributed to the Animal Liberation Front happened at the University of Hawaii's Marine Laboratory in Honolulu in 1977, where 2 dolphins were transported by truck to the ocean and released. The first action officially claimed by the ALF was in 1979 when they liberated a cat, 2 dogs, and 2 guinea pigs from NYU's medical center. The ALF really likes this term liberated, which is pretty vague, but generally means they move them to a safe home or release them to the wild or some type of sanctuary. In 1984, the ALF broke into the University of Pennsylvania's head injury lab and stole over 60 hours worth of footage that was shot by researchers there. The footage, which showed severe mistreatment of animals as well as unsafe and cruel practices by the researchers, was handed over to the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, who turned it into a short film. Gary Francione, a notable lawyer in the animal rights movement, described the release of the film as probably the most important event in the history of the American animal rights movement. A similar event happened a year later at the University of California, Riverside, where this time the ALF took footage themselves of inhumane experiments being performed on monkeys there. This was again given to PETA, who published the videos, resulting in 8 of the university's research programs that tested on animals being cut. Breaking into university laboratories was quickly becoming the ALF's main activity, like when they did it again in 1986 at the University of Oregon, liberating over 200 animals from the psychology department's labs. Universities, however, were taking steps to prevent this kind of incident. Security at labs that tested on animals was significantly increased from the mid-80s onward, as well as these programs being kept much more secret. The ALF's tactics changed with this, and the large-scale liberations they were initially known for were no longer feasible. The overall strategy for the movement shifted to that of economic action, trying to sabotage and hurt those who profit off the exploitation of animals. The ALF sought to make it as financially risky as possible to operate a business or do research that uses animals. In 1987, they would cause over $5 million worth of damage by torching the Animal Diagnostics Laboratory at UC Davis, destroying a building and 20 vehicles. Several other major arsons would follow shortly after, primarily at universities, causing millions more in damages. This shift in strategy made much of the American public turn on the ALF, however. Whereas before they were doing relatively minor property damage and exposing some pretty unethical things, these new attacks were mostly destructions for destruction's sake. It is worth noting, however, the ALF never actually hurt anyone in any of their actions. They did come pretty close a couple times, but luckily nobody was ever injured. The ALF did briefly see a return to its previous more focused actions at the very start of the 1990s, mainly led by the activist Rod Coronado. Coronado is probably the most important singular person in the American direct-action animal rights movement, before this having been involved in major actions abroad, such as sinking 2 whaling ships in Iceland as part of the Sea Shepherds Conservation Society. He led a group in 1991 to destroy an experimental mink farm at Oregon State University. The animals were released, much of the university's equipment was destroyed, and the barn planned to house the animals was burned down. The entire program was cancelled as a result. An already established mink farm in Yamhill, Oregon had its processing plant destroyed in a fire by the same group, resulting in the farm being permanently closed. This was all part of the wider Operation Bite Back, a targeted ALF campaign against the American fur industry. Much of this involved undercover work by Coronado, who, using aliases and funded by loans from animal rights groups, often purchased animals from fur farms and had them rehabilitated and returned to the wild. Coronado led a group on a raid at Washington State University in late 1991 where they targeted the office of a researcher developing new types of traps for wild fur animals. Multiple animals were released, and the researcher's office was covered in hydrochloric acid. Coronado, however, had been seen by a witness at a nearby print shop where he had faxed information about the raid to local media, and a sketch of him was made and distributed by police. The fur industry group, the National Board of Fur Farm Organizations, put out a $35,000 award for information leading to the arrest of the people behind the recent raids. As a result, Coronado laid low for some time and left the Pacific Northwest. He would be active again soon enough, however, this time with an ALF group in Michigan. This group would keep up the campaign against the fur industry into 1992, this time targeting Michigan State University's mink research and farming facilities. The research office was ransacked and then firebombed, causing over $1 million in damages. 32 years worth of research for mink farming was destroyed. They also went to the research farm itself 4 miles away, prying open a roof hatch to get in. Once inside, they poured sulfuric acid over various critical items, targeting research logs and feed preparation machinery and a gas chamber used to kill minks. They then moved to the 4 sheds used to house the minks, removing the identification cards used to keep track of them and opening the cages holding the 350 animals. Most of the minks didn't leave, as it turns out, and they were found still in their cages later, agitated and startled but unharmed. Coronado would ultimately be tracked down and arrested in 1994 for the firebombing. PETA donated money towards his defense, but he ultimately pleaded guilty to the charge of aiding and abetting arson. He didn't admit to the crime, but stated he took the plea deal due to his belief he could not win the case. He was sentenced to the oddly specific number of 57 months in jail and a $2 million fine. Coronado admitted 25 years later, however, that he was indeed the one behind the attack and that he acted alone, though this assertion is disputed. He has since also disavowed taking any intimidating or threatening actions like the firebombing and now runs a non-profit focused on monitoring illegal wolf hunting. But back to the 90s for a moment. Coronado's arrest brought an end to Operation Bite Back, but Operation Bite Back 2 would begin, in theory, shortly after. Bite Back 2 doesn't seem to have done a whole lot, though the ALF claims it's still going on today. The most major action of the second part seems to be the release of 10,000 minks from a farm in Mount Angel, Oregon. It was around this time in the mid to late 1990s that the US federal government, particularly the FBI and ATF, began taking an interest in animal rights direct action groups as a possible domestic terrorist threat. For a time in the late 90s and early 2000s, animal rights direct action and the broader eco-terrorism movement was considered by the FBI to be the biggest terrorist threat facing the United States. Yes, even after 9/11. The ALF was law enforcement's primary concern, but it wasn't the only one. Probably more dangerous was a group that rejected the foundational ALF rule of preventing bodily harm to humans, that being the Animal Rights Militia, or ARM. Like the ALF, it is believed to have originated in Britain. The group's first known action was an attempt to assassinate Margaret Thatcher in 1982 by mailing a bomb to her. Similar to the ALF, its decentralized nature allowed it to spread to North America easily. Their first known action in the United States was an arson at the San Jose Valley Veal and Beef Company in 1987, causing $10,000 in damages. Besides this, however, not much can be attributed to the ARM in the US for a long time. They were more active in the UK. Up in Canada, however, they were developing a strange tactic they would soon employ in the United States. In 1992 in Alberta, local news outlets were sent messages claiming the new candy bar Canadian Cold Buster had been injected with liquid oven cleaner to protest the alleged animal testing used in its creation. The product was pulled from shelves in Calgary and Edmonton, though it was later found the bars were injected with harmless saline and not anything dangerous. It took until 2006 for them to bring this to America, when they poisoned 487 bottles of Palm brand pomegranate juice on the East Coast with an unknown substance. This was in protest of the Palm Company using animal testing to demonstrate the health benefits and antioxidant effects of their product. Ultimately, it took intervention from Whole Foods, who after being forced to pull the product, said Palm juice would not be returning to their stores unless animal testing was halted. Palm acquiesced to the demand in early 2007. Other than that, the only major ARM action in the United States was the release of some turkeys from a farm in Vermont in 2010 and again in 2011. It's because of this limited number of actions that some people doubt the animal rights militia's existence as an actual organized movement and consider it as more of a label the more radical groups have used. The FBI never even named them in their reports on animal rights extremism, though there was another group they considered to be a high priority, the Earth Liberation Front. The ELF, or ELVs as they're sometimes called because of the acronym, started in, you guessed it, the UK. The ELF began as an offshoot of the group Earth First in the early 90s by former members of that group who were dissatisfied with its lessening radicalism. The ELF keeps the same pro-environment stance of Earth First, but is more uncompromising, with an overall goal of eventually restoring the planet to a completely unpolluted and natural state. The ELF in America had a strong early supporter in James F. Phillips, an environmental activist better known under his alias, The Fox. Phillips was a middle school science teacher and had been one of the earliest known direct action activists in America, operating in the Chicago area. He was known for his theatrical tactics, such as plugging smokestacks and sewer outlets at polluting factories and organizing protests and boycotts under his pseudonym. The ELF and ALF in America quickly established close ties and would carry out actions together frequently going forward. The initial cooperation was mainly the ALF publishing ELF communications and documents for them around 1993. Soon enough, however, they would perform direct actions jointly. In October of 1996, the two organizations began targeting the U.S. Forest Service. This was due to the Forest Service's perceived failures at protecting woodlands, a sentiment that increased sharply after the Rare 2 decision, which allotted an additional 36 million acres of forest for commercial logging. They torched a truck belonging to the Forest Service in Detroit, Oregon, and burned down a ranger station in Oak Ridge, Oregon shortly after, causing over $5 million in damages. Also in defense of forests, the ELF would organize extensive tree spiking campaigns. Tree spiking is the practice of driving nails or rods into trees to prevent their harvesting by loggers. The spikes damage any blades that touch them, making them difficult to cut down and nearly impossible to process later at a sawmill. It's also highly illegal, since there's a very serious risk of this causing severe injury or death to both loggers and sawmill workers, as this essentially turns trees into fragmentation explosives the second a blade hits the spike. The ALF and ELF would be busy throughout the late 90s, with some of their most costly attacks happening during this period. They caused $2 million in damages in just one incident by throwing a firebomb through the window of the Alaskan Fur Company in Bloomington, Minnesota. They also set off 6 pipe bombs shortly after at the Utah Fur Breeders Agricultural Cooperative in Sandy, Utah. This damaged the main office of the cooperative and several trucks, causing over $1 million in damages. One of the ALF and ELF's most famous actions would be in late 1998 at the Vail Ski Resort in Colorado. This was in response to the resort's planned expansion into lynx habitats, some of the last suitable forests for the species in the Rocky Mountains. The two groups burned a restaurant, 4 hotel buildings, as well as 3 chairlifts, causing over $26 million in damages. The FBI called it one of the worst terrorist attacks in American history up to that point. As you may have noticed, many of the ALF and ELF's more major and brazen actions took place in and around the greater Pacific Northwest region. These were primarily the work of a particular cell known as the Family, a group of around 20 people working for the two groups. This cell was particularly organized and close, and had caused over $50 million in damages between 1995 and 2001. Ultimately, it would take a dedicated FBI task force from multiple FBI field offices to bring an end to the Family, an Operation Backfire in 2004. 17 people were indicted for the cell's crimes, and 16 were arrested, with 1 still remaining wanted today. Despite all the resources allocated to dismantle the Family, there was still one group who the FBI labeled as the most dangerous animal rights activists in the country. The Justice Department, yes, it's a confusing name, originated in the UK in the early 90s. Okay, someone has to tell me, what were they putting in the water in Britain? Like what? How are they all British? Anyway, the Justice Department began operating in the United States sometime around 1999. The JD was far more targeted in its attacks. Instead of going after institutions or companies, they would frequently focus on individuals. The group even went as far as to denounce groups that insisted on nonviolence, and said in one 1997 statement, "We won't be asking anyone to stop messing with animals and make no more excuses for our violent intervention. They've had it too good for too long." Their modus operandi was primarily mailing trapped letters to those they targeted. Often these would be filled with incendiary devices or explosives, though in the US it was mainly razor blades. Often these would be dipped in rat poison, or in one case, blood contaminated with HIV. In America and Canada, they employed these tactics in an extensive campaign against the fur industry and scientist testing on animals. At least 80 letters were sent out containing both leaflets and razor blades. The leaflets contained demands to end all animal-related activities by the year 2000, or the next letter would contain a bomb. Despite no injuries being reported, the FBI quickly labeled the Justice Department as the most dangerous animal rights group. It's these perhaps hasty and hyperbolic decisions by law enforcement that this period has sometimes been called the Green Scare. In the early 2000s, even with the war on terror happening, the FBI was still really focused on animal rights and eco-terror groups. It would take a 2005 Senate hearing to settle the matter, where the animal rights threat was deemed a low priority. This was mainly because, I'll reiterate, animal rights groups never actually injured or killed anyone. The law has gotten stricter since, however, and laws like the 2006 Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act have given police more ability to prosecute those who would attempt to interfere with facilities that use animals. With laws like this, and increased security at labs and farms, direct action activism has become much rarer in recent years. The days of brazen laboratory raids and burning down fur farms are mostly behind us, and activists have shifted to education and non-violent methods for spreading their message. Direct action still does happen, but it's much more limited and seems to be more popular in Europe than the United States. You might still see the names of these organizations at vegan events and such, but things like the Animal Liberation Front exist more in theory than practice nowadays. The events I mentioned don't add up to being even close to an exhaustive list, but I tried to include the most notable ones. I hope I've given a decent overview of a pretty strange and not often talked about period and movement in American history. The movement was surprisingly organized and competent for lacking much formal leadership, and is still one of the largest domestic terrorist movements the country has ever seen.
The 9X Small Business Center for Long Island is presently closed. The hours of operation are Monday to Friday from 9 to 5, excluding holidays.